This podcast is part of the Batman Universe Podcast Network, hosted by the BatmanUniverse.net. Check out everything related to Batman and the entire Bat family at the BatmanUniverse.net, including news and original content related to comics, movies, television, merchandise, video games, and more. Also, check out some of the other unique podcasts that TBU has to offer. Consider supporting this podcast by becoming a patron on Patreon. Even $1 can go a long way in supporting this content that you enjoy. Look for a link over at the BatmanUniverse.net to offer your support now. And now, on with the show.
In 2008, a podcast was created with one goal: to bring Bat fans around the world news related to movies, comics, video games, television, merchandise, and so much more. And now, the Batman Universe Podcast has returned.
Hello everyone, welcome to the latest episode of the TBU Podcast. I'm Dustin, joining today is BJ and Scott, and today it's all about the Batman, yet again. And I assume that, I warned everybody that this was going to happen, but we're going to be talking about the Batman for a lot of different weeks, a lot of different topics that stem from the film itself. This week we're specifically talking about sequels. Sequels to the Batman, what we can expect, what has been officially announced, what hasn't been officially announced, what we're hoping for, kind of hints at some of the ideas that might be floating around out there as possibilities for the future. And then obviously the biggest thing, which we'll start with, is kind of how the Batman ends, which we talked about last episode, but this time we're going to dive a little bit more into it. And let's just start with that. So the Batman ends with Riddler's plan ultimately failing. Batman stops him, but he is introduced to a new person who says that he can be his friend. We know that is the Joker. There was some debate amongst people in general about whether or not it actually was the Joker, but IGN and Collider both released videos the day that the film actually released, with Matt Reeves confirming that it was in fact the Joker. And that they did not want to take away from the Riddler. They had a whole nother scene that they filmed, and that at some point they believe that they'll release, which led us to think that maybe the loading sequence that was on Rata Alada was going to potentially open that sequence up, but it didn't, which is not necessarily a bad thing. I don't mind it being necessarily something else that could be released in the future, but the Rata Alada, when it finally loaded, it was basically like an info dump of all kinds of journal entries and the pictures of like actual pictures of the Riddler's hideout and plans for the rat maze and things like that. So there's a lot of the stuff that Riddler we've already seen in the film, but this is like more in depth. You can appreciate it a lot more. I imagine a lot of this stuff is actually going to probably appear in the Art of Batman book when it releases next month, but nonetheless, it was a lot of interesting items, but that was the extent of it. Then, if you happen to reload the page after you got the info dump, it said, I don't remember the exact words, but it basically said, everybody knows, and then there was another message to decipher, and it said, Gotham loves a comeback. So the intent is that they're setting it up, the viral marketing or the alternate reality game that is happening, that version of the game is leaning into the idea that the Joker is going to play a more prominent role in the future, because one of the sequences that happened before you get the info dump is that he said, I'm fine here with my new friend. So they're setting it up like they're going to be partners, or they're going to be involved in something. So a lot of people online immediately lean into the idea, well, obviously Joker's got to be in the next film. And personally, I don't think that's the case. I think that they're setting up Joker to appear in the future, but I think it would make a lot more sense for Joker to kind of stay a little bit mysterious for the sequel, and then maybe the third film, Joker teams up with some villains from the first film and the second film, and Batman has a much harder group of characters that he has to deal with rather than just one or two characters that he's dealt with in the previous films. It builds the conflict for Batman much higher. It has higher. I don't know. I can't think of the word because my mind's drawing a blank. But it's higher risk or higher threats that Batman would have to deal with more so than just one or two villains that we've seen in the previous films. And when we look at films in general, superhero films, that is, there's this tendency to, you always want to try to be better than the last one. You don't want to necessarily start with your best villain. That's not always the case. It doesn't work with every superhero film. But a lot of superhero films build to something bigger and worse. And I think it was mentioned last week, the idea that the Avengers films, when they all started, it was hinted at that Thanos was out there, but then it took like multiple movies for that to build to the fact that you actually believed he was a true threat. And I think that is something that they could do with the Joker and make it really interesting without taking away from a lot of the other villains that are still out there and still able to be potentially used. What do you guys think?
Yeah, I don't think it's going to be the Joker. I have a feeling on who the next villain might be. Just the more I think about this movie, and then I went back and I saw it again, the more I kind of feel like the comeback story itself, like that line is a clue, and it doesn't necessarily mean Riddler. It means a different villain, and I have ideas about that, but I think the Joker thing, would serve better as a third or even ideally a fourth film villain. And what made the Batman great, I think one of its strengths, that Matt Reeves should continue with, and like the studio should continue with, is this idea that they took stories that like comic fans knew and kind of blended them in a new way and utilizing characters in a different way that like most film going audiences weren't familiar with. It was like, for people who don't read the comics at all, it was a very fresh story. So, and I think continuing down that road by, maybe borrowing different plot lines that could be tethered to what we just saw, in a way that film audiences haven't seen again, will probably pay off. And you can do it in a way that's just, tops what we've seen because of the way the ending, the way the final moments of the film play out.
I'm really not looking forward to the Joker in the next movie, at least, because I think it'd be kind of almost copying like the Nolan trilogy where, all right, we have our first movie, but then second one, we're right in there with the Joker. So I think, like you said, Dustin, almost kind of build Joker up as kind of like a Thanos level threat, where you kind of, in the second one, maybe tease him in the third one, and then boom, he's in there for a fourth one, causing all sorts of mayhem and chaos. So yeah, I'm not. Keep the teases, keep little, maybe next movie we'll see his full face, we'll see his smile and everything, but for a full Joker reveal, we'll save that for the fourth.
Yeah, I agree. Well, obviously, I mean, you agreed with me, but
you agree with the agreement of yours.
Yes. I like the idea of like the slow build. Like, this was a really good film. And anytime I think we see a really good film, like with Batman Begins, it was a really good film. We're anticipating the next film. We're wondering when the next film is going to come out. But we also have to keep in mind that some of these films take years to actually create. Between filming it and editing it, the directors work on these projects for like 3 years potentially at a time. And there's a lot that goes into making these films. So the thing that as a moviegoer or an audience member or someone who obviously sees these films and appreciates it, one of the things that I think that we get accustomed to is we always want more. I mean, that's just how society is nowadays. Is when's the next movie? That's the question. What are we going to get? When are we going to see more of this Batman? We really like it, and whenever something is really good and the audiences love it, the critics love it, all of that happens, there's this tendency to try to like make something happen as soon as possible. And it doesn't always happen. I mean, when you look at The Dark Knight was the most successful Batman film of the modern age. And then all of a sudden we had to, instead of waiting 3 years, it was 4 years before we got The Dark Knight Rises. There was a little bit more time because Nolan went and did another big movie in between those films. And that's not to say that Matt Reeves is not going, he's going to go off and do something else. He's obviously tied to Warner Brothers to a certain degree because he's not only involved with the Batman film, he's involved in the development and he's a producer for the spin-off series that will occur that are connected to the same universe. But he's also got his hand in some other things. He's attached to that animated Batman series that is kind of being revamped from the animated series, where he's attached to that along with J.J. Abrams and Bruce Timm and James Tucker. There's a lot of they're all involved in this new series. Not to say that ties into the Batman universe. It doesn't. But you can tell he has a love for this character. So I feel like if anything, we are going to get probably more from him than I think a lot of people would expect, because I think he's going to be a lot more involved in other things than Chris Nolan necessarily was, because Chris Nolan, he did his films, and they're great films, but he did his films and then he had other projects that he wanted to do, and there was other things that he wanted to accomplish. But Matt Reeves comes across as the type of person who, where when he gets his sights set on something, that's what he's focusing on. He's not necessarily focusing on other things. Looking at specific comments that have been made, Matt Reeves was interviewed and they asked him about a sequel, and he said he specifically made the Batman with not necessarily thinking, how can I make this the first movie of more, but that doesn't mean he hasn't thought about a sequel. He wanted to make this movie self-contained and a complete film by itself, because nowadays we see so many films that come out where it feels like it's just it's a chapter of a larger story. And but you see that from the very first chapter, not the second chapter that's leading into something else, and you can see that they're building an overall story. You watch a film and you can tell that it's part of a larger story, but it doesn't necessarily feel complete by itself always. And that's not what he wanted to do. He wanted to make sure that the Batman was a good film by itself and could stand alone. And then obviously he has said that he has thought about what to do with sequel. Now, there's been a bunch of different comments that released during the press junkets that led up to the release of the film, where a variety of different topics came up between him and Robert Pattinson. They were both asked, like, oh, well, if you guys were going to do a sequel, what characters would you like to use, or what characters would you like to see in the film? And there's been a variety of different answers. We've heard Court of Owls, we've heard Mr. Freeze. There was interest from Pattinson about bringing Robin into it in some way, shape, or form. And those are all good ideas, and I don't have anything necessarily against, honestly, any of those ideas, but I'm sure there's plenty of other ideas that they have already had. We can tell by the end of the film that they're setting things up to be very similar to No Man's Land. In the next episode that we record, we're going to be talking a lot more about the comic connections of the film and how things are kind of like a combination of a variety, like Scott was saying earlier, a combination of a variety of different comic stories, but kind of molded together to tell their own unique story with elements from these other stories. But at the end, No Man's Land is kind of hinted at, where not necessarily they're going to be cordoned off from the rest of the United States necessarily, but you can tell that with some of the comments that are made about how, well, there's going to be a power grab for Gotham, and there's going to be a lot of people who are going to be fighting for power, and that sets things up where Gotham's going to be in a rebuilding phase, just like No Man's Land, and there's going to be a struggle between the people who are trying to grab the power, because there's this vacuum that is basically needing somebody to step up, and Batman will do his best to stop the bad people or the villains from taking over, but he can't necessarily be everywhere at once. So personally, one of the things I think I would really like to see, and I think mostly because I want to see it done really well in film, is I'd love to see the introduction in some way, shape, or form of the Bat family, because I feel like that could also really help lead into a larger threat where they have to face multiple villains on multiple fronts and have a larger cast of characters that can help Batman by himself. Obviously, for other reasons, I would love to have the Batman universe introduced to the Batman films, because that is what we are all about. We're not just about Batman. We're also about all the other characters that make up the universe. Whether they do, Robin, I don't necessarily, I'd love to see them do Robin true to the comics, but I understand that not everything can be exactly to the comics. There's all kinds of things that get changed all the time. So I think when it comes to Robin or Batgirl or Nightwing or any of these other characters, like if they did time jumps, I don't necessarily think I would be opposed to that. I think that could be one way of making things work, where you don't have to focus so much on Batman working alongside a child for a larger period of time, because I know there is like this problem with this 12-year-old boy working alongside Batman and facing down barrels of guns and things like that. So I'd love to see the Bat family. That's the one thing that I really wish happens in the sequel. What's something that you guys want to see? Not necessarily villains, because we'll get to that, but what's other things you'd like to see come of the sequel?
Bruce Wayne, but the caveat to that is I echo your thoughts about the Bat family. I would love to see them. But I would also love to see, one of my favorite things in Batman stories, both comics, they've done in the animated series, everything, is this idea that at night, when he's Batman, he goes around and he stops a crime, or he, stops theft or whatever it is he's doing. But during the day as Bruce Wayne, depending on who the criminal is that's causing these havocs, he'll use his Bruce Wayne ability to land that person a job or stabilize them. So, he's doing both the stopping of the crime and almost like social work in a way to make sure that that same crime involving that same person doesn't happen again. And to me, that's, in this film, we saw the story of a vigilante becoming a hero by the end. To me, that's, kind of the ultimate heroism is problem solving on a way where you're taking actions to prevent future crimes. And so seeing that kindness kind of come through and echo through the Bruce Wayne persona, that he can use both parts of him, to his ability to essentially save Gotham.
Always rooting for some variation of the Bat family, bring in Robin somewhere along the way. I think there's a way that they can do it, and I think the first movie, Bruce was always key for that the mayor's son, so they kind of laid seeds of he sees an orphan, it kind of hits him in in a soft spot. So I think he could, and I think they're going to set up more where he is Bruce Wayne more in the movie instead of just fully Batman, where we're going to see him lay into that more persona, and maybe he'll go to the circus, or maybe he'll see someone stealing the wheels off the Batmobile, or one of the other Robin origins we've gotten in our lives. But I'm for some Robin. I think it was big for Pattinson to say that, to even mention Robin, because I remember Christian Bale said that if they ever introduced Robin, he would quit or something along those lines. I don't know if you guys remember that, but I think it was big to have Pattinson kind of speak up for Robin, and for the star of the movie to say it was huge.
Yeah. It was really great in general, because it seemed like when he was doing press, and I can't say this is nothing against Christian Bale, but he's the only other Batman outside of Ben Affleck that has been the Batman for the length of me running the site. And I don't remember, as dialed as I was into everything that was going on with the release of The Dark Knight and The Dark Knight Rises, I don't remember Bale really talking about the comics that much. I'm sure he was asked questions about the comics and things like that, but he wasn't immediately talking about it. And one of the things that I remember hearing about when Pattinson first was announced as Batman was, anytime anybody would ask him about him being cast, he was seeking out playing Batman because he likes the character of Batman. It wasn't like he was, oh, well, this is a role and I want to be, some megastar who's Batman. He actually is a Bat fan in general. And that's why it's always interesting when you hear some of his answers when they're asking him questions that are not necessarily specifically comic based, but what kind of characters would you like to see? What do you want to see, your character do, and things like that. And some of his answers are very, you can tell to a very even if he's never read a comic book in his life, he's at least watched some of the animated stuff, or he's at least watched some of the other Batman films and things like that, because he has answers for these different questions that are very specific to somebody who would have to know enough about Batman outside of their own script. And that's not to say, I know Ben Affleck is also a Batman fan too, so it's not to say that he wasn't, but I think there was so much other stuff going on with that role and what they were trying to do that it really wasn't a very Batman centric situation. It was, well, we're making the DC universe. It's not necessarily we're making the Batman universe, and this very much feels like the Batman universe. So last week it was officially announced that the Penguin series is officially been picked up with a series order for at HBO Max. So that's officially happening. It's pretty expected because that was announced a while back that they were playing with the idea of making that series, and Colin Farrell has talked about it multiple times about how he really enjoyed playing the character and that. So that's not a huge surprise. Now, the other series that was in development was... It's kind of weird how this all played out. So there was another series that originally, the first one that was announced, was focusing on the GCPD. Then there was a comment that came out saying that Matt Reeves said something about that they were working on something that focused on Arkham. And a lot of people took that as, wait, there's 3 different series coming? And it wasn't that at all. It turns out the GCPD series, which then people were like, oh, well, they're not doing the GCPD series. That series has kind of morphed into a series that is going to focus on Arkham to a degree. I don't know what degree, and that's not to say it won't have the GCPD in it, but that's the other project that they're currently working on. Nothing has concretely been announced as far as a series order or anything like that for that series. But the advantage with streaming now is that nowadays you have the ability to make a film, and then it might take, potentially 5 years to make another film. Dylan Clark, one of the producers for the film, specifically said he this is his quote: "I will go on the record and say that the next film will be made in less than 5 years." Now, that's a long time in the larger scheme of things. Like 5 years is a huge stretch. Between Batman Begins and The Dark Knight, there was 3 years. Between Dark Knight and Dark Knight Rises, there was 4 years. 5 years would be a long time. So obviously he's given himself some leeway, but with these other series that potentially tie into it, the Penguin series, this other Arkham series, those could be the easy thing to fill the gap for people who are looking for more of the character and more of that universe. So I love the fact that this stuff is moving forward, but also it has the ability to build on it. For anybody who saw the Suicide Squad and then watch The Peacemaker takes one individual character and then develops them into their own full-fledged thing where it has nothing to necessarily do with the Suicide Squad, which I can appreciate a lot, not because I didn't enjoy the Suicide Squad, but because I think that ultimately the Peacemaker, I did not expect him to be a character that I would enjoy watching the series of, but it was really good. And I think Penguin is like that too, in the sense of you can take this character that was, that had a prominent role in the film, but then develop them into something so much more and be able to do something that fans can really appreciate without necessarily needing to have the main character of Batman in the show.
Yeah. I mean, I love it. And I think the thing I'm hoping for, is the way I look at the ending with the No Man's Land setup is that it's kind of just an open canvas for them to do whatever they want. And they have this groundwork where the Penguin, obviously we see him his eyes scanning the city when they're talking about the power grab. So I kind of hope that it, to fill the gaps, it's kind of becomes its own vehicle for adding minor characters and continuing the world build on what Matt Reeves puts together, to where they could put in, just C or D-listers that we would never see in the Batman official movies, somewhere maybe along the lines of the Flamingo or something, or some of your other weird ones. But I just it's fun, and I don't know, I'm really looking forward to it too with Colin Farrell, because he was so good, and that was one thing I really wanted more of.
What's Matt Reeves' role going to be on the Penguin? Is he writing it? I think that's what made Peacemaker so good, is that James Gunn wrote every episode and directed all of them, I think, except one. So I think if Matt really involved, I think like if he's writing it or maybe directing a few episodes here, it's probably at least direct the premiere. First episode, I would assume.
Yeah, I'm not sure, because what I've heard in general is that he's going to be a producer for the series, but I don't know that he's necessarily. I mean, I'm sure he's going to have some sort of credit when it comes to writing it, just because he's probably got ideas. Otherwise, when they pitched him, what characters could we develop into, for a series, and he immediately was like the Penguin. He had to have some sort of idea. So I'm not sure if he's going to be writing or directing anything. That's not to say he couldn't, but I think that the Peacemaker and James Gunn was a very unique situation, because they filmed that completely like under quarantine and like away from everybody else, and they just happened. Like, my understanding is that he finished editing the Suicide Squad. They asked him if he was interested in doing if he had any ideas of how to like develop something into a series for HBO Max, and he was like, "Yeah, Peacemaker." And they're like, "Okay, what's your ideas?" And then like he retreated back to his place and then just went crazy and wrote the entire thing himself, because he just had time on his hands because of quarantine and COVID and stuff. So, and then conveniently, it just so happened that they were able to film it all under quarantine as well, because I remember last April or something, I remember reading something about how John Cena was unable to travel for WrestleMania because he was in the middle of filming Peacemaker, and he couldn't leave because he did basically have to quarantine for like 6 weeks before they could start refilming, and it was just too much time or something like that. So I think that was a unique thing where it just happened to fall together with James Gunn involved. I think it worked because he was involved, but I don't necessarily think that. I think if Matt Reeves is like a hands-on producer, it could work under anybody. If he's involved with picking a series runner and things like that, I think it could still work even if he's not writing and directing.
I mean, they could, honestly, if he just picks, a director he trusts, honestly, that could make all the difference. And HBO has, like, some people they tend to work with a lot for various projects. Like, I could honestly see if Matt Reeves, like, picked, like, Terrence Winter from The Sopranos or something, like, that would probably be a decent enough fit.
Well, it's funny you say that, because I'm pretty sure he was originally attached to the GCPD series when that was first announced. Then he ended up leaving because of creative issues, and I don't think it was because there was like a clash. I think it was more of a he had planned to do one specific thing and they did not go that route. But I feel like if he did the Penguin, especially if they're dealing with like the underworld, the Gotham underworld and stuff like that, that would be perfect setup. So, all right, so to wrap up our conversation, the last thing I want to talk about is, so obviously the Joker's coming sometime. The Riddler he's not off the table. The Penguin's not off the table. Catwoman, by all means, I would expect her to come back at some point. I don't think she's going to be a one-and-done character. I really do believe that while she's leaving town and heading to potentially Bloodhaven, she will be back at some point. I think the chemistry between Batman and Catwoman is too good for them to just completely ignore and not have her come back. So that's pretty much set. But talking about, let's hypothesize here and say that the Matt Reeves franchise goes for more than 3 movies. Let's say it goes for 4 or 5 movies, and maybe there's spin-offs and all this other stuff, and there's other streaming series in that. Sticking with the second movie or third movie of the group, imagining that there's a larger plan where it's not just a trilogy and Joker's going to end up having a bigger role in it, what villains would you like to see Matt Reeves develop into characters for the film? And then I guess you could even take that a step further and say, are they a major character or are they a minor character? Kind of how like Riddler and Penguin were, both in the film, but one was the major villain and one is a minor villain, and then you could take that minor villain and then develop it into its own series. Is there characters that you guys would like to see as either a major or a minor in that role in either Batman 2 or 3?
So the one I feel like you can do a lot of connections to, and they did reference it, is Hush. And they made, obviously we saw a snippet with Edward Elliott's name, which we would assume could be his dad, because his name is Tommy Elliott, and then the word hush on the screen. And I feel like that would be a perfect shoe-in, for multiple reasons. One, because of the Riddler connection from the books, obviously the big Hush storyline. Two, there's a comment I believe Alfred makes to Bruce, or maybe a couple of comments throughout the film. My mind's kind of fuzzy on it now, but about, him basically prodding him to like re-enter society as Bruce Wayne and, do something with him. The fact that he doesn't want to meet, investors and go out. And so, Alfred pushing him that way. And now that, we've kind of settled the vigilante storyline and he's more of a hero, maybe, when they try to reintroduce Bruce Wayne, your perfect foil to that character, that socialite, would be like Tommy Elliott back in town. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the comeback story, that Riddler talks about, like, wow, that's something that Joker says to Riddler in Arkham. Maybe the true spin on it or deceit of it is that it's, maybe that's a Tommy Elliott allusion there too. Someone who, we saw that was whose father was bumped off by Carmine Falcone at the behest of Thomas Wayne, re-entering Gotham and the graces of Gotham's elite, or what, exists of it after this no man's land scenario.
I think Hush is definitely, out of all the big Batman villains, he's the one who's really kind of never gotten a big push, like obviously on film. And of the Hush storyline, that's like the storyline that kind of like got me back into comics. So I would kind of love to see like a different twist, because I don't think you can fully adapt that storyline because it's so rooted in Batman villain history. But one I would kind of like to see, maybe he's in like a gang war with the Penguin, but I would kind of like to see the ventriloquist in Scarface. I'd love to kind of see like whatever Matt Reeves would do, the Goofy with the puppet, and it could be pretty creepy with just kind of a creepy Chucky-like doll sitting there, and the mouth's not, but you hear a voice. Maybe not the villain for a full movie, but at least like a camp, kind of like a Penguin, like in the Batman.
You could even see
that could be scary.
Yeah, they could even do the ventriloquist in like the Penguin series, because it could have that tied to the underworld or the mobsters and stuff like that. There's a lot of characters that are obviously connected to the mobster side of it that could eventually have a role when it comes to the Batman or with the Penguin series. When it comes, like, I know a lot of people have been on this Court of Owls kick, because there's this, Court of Owls, they're playing a huge role in the Gotham Knights game that's coming out. They have obviously been very popular in comics that Scott Snyder wrote, but I think that I'm not saying that I wouldn't want the Court of Owls involved, but I think I would rather them, instead of like them presenting a Talon and saying, here's a Talon, Batman, fight the Talon kind of situation, I would like them to be kind of like pulling the strings of some villains behind the scenes or something like that, like orchestrating other villains into a situation. Like the Hush thing that got mentioned, that if Hush was the villain, obviously the famous Hush storyline involves Batman trying to figure out the mystery and then who is Hush and what's going on. And there's like this, every issue he's coming in contact with one of his big villains. And I think you could introduce a lot of different characters if you had Hush and you went not necessarily exactly that route, but like have the character play this like mysterious role and not know exactly how to deal with it, and then he has to end up going around and asking some other villains and things like that, because you could introduce villains. But I would probably want to stay away from like top tier villains, because it would be very difficult to be like, well, here's Poison Ivy, here's Two-Face, here's Riddler, here's Joker, and you just keep running off the list, because eventually you don't want to have just that character having like a little cameo and never ends up showing up, because some of these characters could definitely be used in the future for other things. But I think the Court of Owls would be really cool, especially because you could combine that with Tommy Elliott in the sense of like they could be pulling the strings, and the whole idea of him having something against Bruce Wayne because of the whole situation that was revealed with the Riddler. They're clearly setting something like that up, but I think it would be cool to find out that the Court of Owls is kind of like they're the ones who conveniently gave the forensic accounting information to Riddler once they found out that he tried to set the orphanage on fire because he was so pissed about how his childhood worked out. He conveniently got a hold of these ledgers that led him down the rabbit hole of, finding out all this corruption and things like that, because there's always that cool, interesting idea of somebody in the background, and then you could completely pull the rug out from everybody by revealing it's the Court of Owls, but then the Court of Owls is just like sporadically taken out by the Joker, and then the Joker's like, well, it's time to take control of this situation or something like that. I think it'd be a cool twist.
A perfect tie-in too is like, but before Falcone, gets it in the movie, he tells him in the hallway, like, the things I know are going to die with me, and like that's an allusion to something, and I feel like that could be a perfect tether to like Court of Owls, like maybe he was Gotham's buffer, between the Court of Owls and everybody else.
Yeah, I think, and there's a lot of possibilities. I mean, there's other villains that I think that I'd also love to see done differently than they have done in the past. Mr. Freeze is one that I really think, especially if they followed the Mr. Freeze from the animated series and they did something where it was more of a troubled soul kind of character rather than somebody who's, all about the quips that Arnold Schwarzenegger's Mr. Freeze was. And obviously they've leaned into the idea that he was trying to do it for his wife, but I don't think they did a very good job because it just came off too comedic. But I would like to see a Mr. Freeze that is like, like a tortured soul kind of character. But then also there's Poison Ivy's ripe for, a better interpretation in live action as well. Although she keeps being used over and over again in the TV shows. She was in Gotham. She's in Batwoman. She's been in a lot of different characters. I don't know that their priority, well, I should say the higher-ups' priority for that character are as important. But thinking completely outside the box, and it's funny because Matt Reeves has actually said this wouldn't work in his universe, is Man-Bat. Because he said that because his universe is grounded, somebody like Man-Bat wouldn't appear. And I think there's a way to do something like that, but not necessarily as a main character. I think as a minor character, not one that could hold its own streaming series or something like that. But I think that there's a bunch of characters like Man-Bat, Killer Croc, or Clayface that are like, they're larger than life in the sense of like they're like just on that like step outside of grounded versions of the character, as far as like their origins are grounded, but they're not. They're to a degree they're more than just a mobster. They're more than just somebody with a gun or somebody who's really smart or someone, like there's an element to them that's a little bit more fantastical than some of the other villains that exist. But I think that like Man-Bat would be an interesting one to like show up, even if it was just like he becomes Man-Bat and that's the extent of it. Batman has to lean on Kirk Langstrom for information, and then we just happen to find out that he's working on a serum. Kind of like how the Spider-Man films hinted at Dr. Connor for like multiple films when Sam Raimi was doing the films. Or Clayface is another one. Like, it's more fantastical, but a character like that they could do something very unique because he's basically a shapeshifter, and I think it's something different. So I don't want to immediately discount some of the fantastical villains that exist in the Batman universe because they're not necessarily as grounded as some of the other ones that are more about, besting Batman in IQ or besting Batman by, raising an army or having partners or something like that. I think that there's a way to do it, and I think if the right person did it, it could work even in a grounded universe.
I really don't consider him like a Batman villain, but I think Deathstroke, we bring him in, maybe he's hired by the Court of Owls to take out Batman, and we can finally have like Batman take on someone who's just as equally matched fighting wise. I think we've really never before. Yeah,
that would be cool. And then I really do like the idea of Clayface. I feel like the more like the scarier looking or more horror themed Batman villains would look really good in Matt Reeves' universe, like his style and his tone. You know, like how you mentioned Man-Bat, you know, and then like Killer Croc or something. Just someone who, you know, you could really embody kind of a monstrous look, but also, you know, with Clayface, there's like, depending on how it's done, like we saw in the James Tynion detective run, like he's like crying in a theater, you know, there's like pathos to him and everything, you know, there's more of a round. He's not just like some jerk who wants to like kill everybody.
Right.
So,
there's like a redeeming factor with some of them, and I think that's the way that you could do it. Where some of these, especially the monster versions of some of these characters, like they look like a monster, but they have the ability to be redeemed. Where it's not just, well, we lock them up and that's the end of it, because those characters, especially in more recent runs, Man-Bat, Killer Croc, and Clayface, have all had some sort of redeeming factor where they're not necessarily just about, thievery or killing people or whatever. It's not about that. There's something more to it, and I think that's also what makes really good villains, and that's why Batman has such a great rogues gallery when it comes to villains, is because there's so many different types of villains. You've got the monsters, you've got the gangsters, you've got the crazies, you've got the super smart guys. There's so many different characters that Batman has that you could focus on. It'll just be nice to see, and I really will say, like, as much as I don't want a film crammed with villains, and I was worried because when we found out Riddler and Penguin and Catwoman, and obviously put aside Catwoman being a villain, but Catwoman, and then you still had Falcone, and then you still have to introduce Batman, you still have to introduce Gordon, and you're like, wow, there's a lot of characters, but it worked. And I think because it works so well, I want to see it done again, specifically so that we can have other characters have this, the build and the focus that all of these characters equally got. I mean, like, Penguin is not in the film that much, but when he is, he steals the scene a lot of the times. All right, so with all of that being said, that's going to wrap up this episode. Like I said, next week we're going to be talking about the comic connections to the Batman. There's a lot of different comics that have come that the film draws inspiration from. We're going to talk about some of those stories next week. So that is, if you're looking for all kinds of other stuff related to the Batman, I will say the one thing that there is no shortage of is merchandise. And I'll just plug the website here by saying head over to the website, because a lot of the recent news, once the film is now released, is all about merchandise that is featuring the likeness of the characters from the Batman film. So there's tons of different stuff. Be sure to check out the site, thebatmanuniverse.net, for not only merchandise news, but also movie, TV, video games, and anything else related to the Bat fandom. You can follow us on all kinds of social media platforms, including Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Discord, YouTube. You can send us emails at tbu@thebatmanuniverse.net. And if you are interested in supporting us, be sure to check out our Patreon, where you can actually get early, unedited versions of these podcasts shortly after they're recorded, and potentially days ahead of when they are actually released to the public. So that is a perk that you can find by subscribing to us on Patreon. With all that being said, thank you so much for listening to this latest episode of the TBU podcast. For BJ, Scott, and myself, we'll see you guys next time.